Thank you very much for attending my talk, WAF Made Easy. My name is Micah K. Brown. Today I'm representing the Greater Cincinnati ISSA chapter and my own experiences as an IT security practitioner. With that being said, I encourage you to go through and to ask any questions in chat. I will be in chat and would love to respond to you. Today, we're going to talk about what is a WAF. We're going to talk about the build, tune, support methodology. We're going to talk about the team that you're going to need to go through and assemble to successfully deploy your WAFs. We're going to go in depth on the build, the tune, and the support phases of this model. And then we're going to talk about architectural decisions that you are going to need to make based on your environment. So, what is a web application firewall? I'm not going to read to you the Wikipedia definition of a web application firewall. To me, a web application firewall is quite simply a compute device that sits between your end users as well as your web applications. The web application firewall is going to examine traffic, decrypt it, compare it against policies, and make permit, deny, alert decisions on that web traffic for you. So right here is a quick visualization. In this case, I'm showing a production environment that has high availability. You'll notice that the load balancer is logically holding the IP address A.A.A.A. So when our user goes through and does a DNS lookup on our web application, they're going to be returned the IP address of our load balancer. The load balancer is going to receive that request, and they're going to choose which WAF they're going to go through, and they're going to send that traffic to. At that point, a TLS connection is going to go through and be created between the user's browser and our web application firewall. Once web traffic hits our web application firewall, the WAF is going to go through and it's going to decrypt it. It's going to go through and look at that traffic. It's going to process it against the policy, make a permit, deny, alert decision, and if it's allowed, it's going to re-encrypt it via a TLS connection to our front-end web servers. So let's talk a bit about the build, tune, support methodology. So when I started the web application firewall project, this was one of the hardest projects that I ever worked on. You see, my path into IT security was very standard for someone of my age. I started out as a help desk, then moved into a server admin role, then moved into a networking admin role before formally becoming part of an IT security architecture and engineering team. And when I got brought on to the WAF project, I acknowledged that I was really strong in traditional IT security, traditional networking, traditional IT architecture. But where I was weakest was in application development. Likewise, I had another member of my architecture and engineering team where he came to IT security through application development. And that meant that he really understood DevSecOps, application security, and where he struggled the most was in traditional IT architecture and networking, the things where I was strongest in. So I started to reevaluate, instead of going through and having Micah be responsible for applications A, B, and C, and my colleague being responsible for D, E, and F, I started to reimagine, what if we played to our strong suits? So I went through and I came up with the build, tune, support model that I sold to our management. And the goal of this model was to set both of us up to success, to make sure that we were going through and working on the part of the project where we could give the most value back to the business. Now, I know this slide is really cramped, and if you are interested in this build, tune, support methodology, I suggest that you go through, simply download the slides, and please feel free to reach out with any questions. But the idea is that you assign a resource to either the build, the tune, or the support team. And you start at the bottom and you build your way up. And once you reach the top of a certain phase, that WAF is going to transition to the next phase. And so we are going to go through and talk about some of the biggest challenges. In my mind, one of the biggest challenges of a WAF infrastructure is that they have a very high total cost of ownership. We're going to have to go through and overcome fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Remember, many of our organizations go through and monetize our app dev folks by measurements of things like system uptime, like availability. So When we as IT security say that we're going to put a device that is explicitly designed to go through and to block your traffic, if it is thought to be malicious, the thought is, what if it accidentally goes through and marks legitimate traffic as malicious? And trust me, it will at some time. It's just an unfortunate consequence of the technology. We need to clearly define what a post SDLC of a web application is once it is being protected by a WAF. Of course, we could go through and we could have potential overlaps with work already done in the app dev pipeline. We're going to ensure that we have support and trust from the application dev team. One thing that really went through and caught me off guard is I found that not all environments were feature identical. And so that caused us to reevaluate some of the decisions around where do we place WAFs and how do we go through and support a specific web application. We'll talk about that. And then we went through and had to decide, how are we going to intercept traffic? Now, generally you can intercept web traffic via DNS or going through and inspecting a certain network segment of traffic, much like you would do with an IPS. Personally, I prefer DNS, and every WAF that I rolled out was done during or via DNS. So now let's go through and let's talk about the team you're going to need to assemble in order to go through and to successfully deploy your WAFs. So ironically, on Team WAF, as I jokingly called it, we're going to need a build resource. So that's going to be someone like me, someone that really understands traditional networking, IT architecture, cloud architecture. And what's really important is, how do you go through and how do you bring in new technology, new compute devices into your environment? Then you're going to need tune resources. Now, these need to be people that have a strong understanding of application development, application security, and common app dev vulnerabilities. And then you're going to need some support resources, the people that are going to go through and make sure that these devices run as they were designed, as they were implemented. And they're really going to go through and need to have a mix of both the build and the tune support system. On team application, we're going to need to define an application owner. Generally, the application owner is going to be a manager or an architect of an application. This is traditionally going to be the person that the business is going to hold accountable for the uptime of that web environment. They are also going to go through and play a critical role of approving every time we move from phase to phase to phase within the build, tune, support model. Next, we're going to need our web app developers. Now, generally, you're going to want to have more senior developers that fully understand the web application that you're deploying to, that they understand the architecture, the intentions, and the future roadmap. We went through and were able to build a lot of trust with them by creating a custom role within each WAF, where they could log in and they could see the customized alerts, the learning suggestions, as well as the performance. That way, if they're seeing something within the web application that is very weird, they can simply log in and they can quickly tell, does this look to be something that the WAF is involved with? And if so, they can reach right out to us, else they can quickly pivot to another troubleshooting strategy. Next, we need testers, and we need a combination of automatic as well as human testing. When it comes to testing, you need both volume of traffic and diversity of traffic. So with that, let's go through and let's dive into the build phase. So the first step in the build phase is establishing our architecture. So we need to clearly and definitively define roles and responsibilities, both for IT security as well as our application developers. We need to learn how web apps are developed and maintained within our environment. Then we can go through and we can define our individual WAF architecture. We can include things like centralized management, logging, and licensing. And one of the biggest successes that we had is, for every environment that we've deployed a WAF into, we created a WAF implementation guide, and we included all of the findings from the architecture phase into the implementation guide. Quite frankly, the implementation guide was a customized blueprint per environment that clearly and concisely went through and defined exactly how we were going to go through and to deploy a WAF in. It was meant to be used as part of the build process where I played a big role, as well as to help the Tune resources go through and understand how the web application firewall was deployed, and even how the support team can go through and quickly bring a resource up to speed on a particular environment. It also had a great benefit in that if an auditor were to question how are your WAF set up, we could just hand them the implementation guide and they could understand in great lengths. Then we move into the plan and design phase. So this is where we start to work with the app devs and the app owner to understand how that particular application worked. We would start out with asking for a quick 2-pager, just the basic who, what, where, when, why, how of their web application, what type of data they store, where they store it. And we'd also ask for things like a network diagram and a data flow diagram. Then we'd get on a call with them and we'd flush out any questions that we had based on that. And collaboratively, we would start to work out that customized implementation guide. We went through and we quickly spelled out, here's what we understand your current state is. Here's what we believe a WAF in your environment would look like from a high level, included updated network diagram, updated data flow diagram. Then we went through and we built out a very detailed section for the build, the tune, and the support phases. And this had a great amount of detail, what to expect at every step of the way. We would go through and we'd have places for customized configuration on the WAF. We'd clearly spell out roles and responsibilities for parties at each step of the way. We'd highlight processes, procedures, SLAs, and where we could, we would go through and heavily document with visuals, because that really helps go through and explain things. Then we would eventually get the approval of the app owner and the app devs. Yes, we feel comfortable with this plan. Let's go execute. Next, we get to the fun part, the cold build. The cold build goes through and encompasses everything from initially turning on a WAF, building out the initial security policy, and then any customizations needed for the specific web application firewall. Then once we finished that process, I'd go through, I'd reach out to the Tune, the app dev and testing, and ask them to leverage host file redirection so that all of their web traffic to our app would naturally flow through the web application firewall. At that point, the tuning resource would look at the learning suggestions, the alerts, and escalate any decisions to app dev if we needed a little bit of help to understand, was this normal, was this abnormal, and make permit deny decisions. At some point, your app devs, your tuning resource are going to feel comfortable. Yes, we are safe to put the actual WAF in line of live traffic. Once we feel confident, we go through, we get the approval of the app owner, we get the needed dates, we procure the needed resources, we submit the needed change controls, and follow our normal processes. Now, in my setting, I did not have ownership of the DNS, and we use DNS to go through and to push out every one of our WAFs in terms of how do we capture the traffic. So when I joined a bridge call, it was kind of simple. I was kind of the coach. I'd start the bridge call, I'd ask for a go, no-go decision. If we were a go, I'd ask the DNS team, can you please change the DNS resources? We'd wait until that replicates. I'd validate that both on a corporate machine as well as a personal device. I'd then ask the person that owned the access control list for the web servers to restrict the actual access so that the web servers of the application could only accept HTTPS from our web application firewalls. Once that had been done, I'd do a simple test. Can I hit the logon page? And if I was, I would then go through and I would ask our testers and our app dev to please start their tests. And usually they would spend about an hour testing both normal as well as niche functionality. Once this call was over, assuming that we were successful, two magical things happened. The first thing, I handed the ownership of that WAF off to my tuning resource, as well as, since we are now in line of live traffic, we started our 24/7 support of that environment. So let's dig into the tune phase. So when we enter the tune phase, we are in transparent/learning mode. That means that as traffic goes through the WAF, it's being inspected via policy, and we don't block it. We alert if there's a violation of policy. So it is critical to at least once a day have your tuning resource meet with the application developers so that you can go through and you can review the learning suggestions or alerts, and you can make finalized permit, deny, tuning decision. It is critical that you have both volume and diversity of traffic. Each block and alert needs to be reviewed. We fell into a trap in one environment where we prioritized reviewing alerts based on the frequency that they happen. And so once we went into blocking mode, even though 99.998% of the traffic flowed clear, there were certain functionalities of the website that only happen once a month, once every 3 months, and we started to block a few of those, and that gave us a couple bad impressions with our app dev folks. And so we need to make sure that we're reviewing all traffic. We need to make sure that our testers are really going through and testing both core as well as niche functionality that is so critical. Now, as you go through the initial tuning, you're going to get a lot of alerts at start, but very rapidly, you're going to go through and you're going to see them descend until where the tuning resource and the application developers have high confidence that the application has been tuned. So in preparation for entering the block mode, we would get the application's owner to move forward. We'd obtain a date, book the needed resources, and submit the change control. Once again, we used a bridge call to go through and to define this. And it was a very simple bridge call. The tuning resource would simply go through, open with a go, no go. If go, you would log into the WAF. It'd take 1 to 2 minutes. He'd set it to blocking. And then once it was set to blocking, he'd throw a specially crafted benign URL. And if we got the block screen, he would turn over the environment to the application developers and testers to go through and to test and see if there were any issues that they could find. This went very well. Once again, about an hour's worth of testing, and we'd close the meeting. Once the meeting was closed, we wanted to make sure that we were handed over WAFs to our support team that were of high integrity. So what we would do is we'd quite simply go through and hold the WAFs in the tune phase for a period of hypercare. And we define that as 1 week with no escalations, no changes to policy that were made outside of standard change control process. With that being said, let's move to the support team. So as we were building these WAFs, or as we were tuning these WAFs, our support team was going through and defining, here's how we are going to support these WAFs. So of course, we need to be able to support day in, day out support. I'm a huge fan of start of day, start of week, start of month procedures. We need to make sure that we are regularly reviewing the learning suggestions, the alerts, and escalating to app dev anything that we have a question about. Of course, we need to support any move add changes. We need to be available for troubleshooting and performance testing. Of course, patching is critical on these types of devices, and documentation is ongoing. Likewise, we need to make sure that we are training our team appropriately and setting our support resources up for success. Now, let's talk about the architecture. For on-premise considerations, are we going to use physical? Are we going to use virtual? All of the 30 WAFs that I deployed within 90 days were virtual machines. And they had a lot of benefits for them being virtual, easy to spin up, but probably the best one, in my personal opinion, is the ability to snapshot them before a major change, before a system patch. Next, how are we going to intercept traffic? Well, I'm a big fan of DNS, and we use DNS for all of our WAFs. Of course, the management port should be on an internal protected VLAN. And once an application is protected by a web application firewall, we need to make sure that our front-end web servers, that they can only receive web requests from our web application firewalls. And if one of your web application firewalls is going through and exceeding excessive CPU memory compute utilization, there is an option to go through and to offload the actual decryption of TLS to another type of product, such as a packet aggregator. So that is an option for you, especially on-premise. And this is a general architecture drawing of what our on-premises looked at from a high level. As you can see, once again, we have a load balancer in front of the first two production WAFs. So logically, if we were to do a lookup, we would be returned the IP address that is on the load balancer, A.A.A.A. For the lower level environment, the public IP address that would be returned is actually logically located on each of the WAFs themselves. So let's talk about cloud considerations. First, how are you going to build these WAFs? Are you going to go through and build out your standard cloud virtual image and then add the WAF software on top of that? Or are you going to go through and use the custom application templates that are part of the cloud store? Of course, you need to worry about rules, laws, regulations, especially data residency. I cannot support or emphasize that much. Next, how are you going to support multi-cloud? Are you going to do a hub and spoke where you go through and you deploy all of your WAFs into your preferred cloud container, and then you enable connections between other cloud environments? Now that could be done via just routing over the internet, or that could be done through something like an IPsec tunnel. But how are you going to do that? Or do you simply go through and do you deploy in the same cloud environment as your web applications are, which technically should be a little bit less latency on your web connections, and that's what we chose to do. Once again, you have the same consideration of how you're going to go through and how you're going to deploy. Personally, I like DNS. Of course, just like our on-prem, we need to protect our management ports. We need to make sure that we close any ACLs for our web servers so that after we put the WAF in line, you cannot bypass the actual WAF in order to reach the web application. And then once again, there might be a valid reason for you to offload the actual TLS decryption onto another device, such as a packet aggregator. So at first we went through and we thought, why don't we just go through and replicate what we were doing in our on-premise environment? And after thinking about it for just a little bit, we realized that in the cloud environments, we are giving our application developers a whole lot more power, a whole lot more privilege in terms of what they can and what they cannot do. And so we quickly discovered they could do things like juggle which IPs were assigned to which devices. They could build special NATs. They could go through power on and power off devices. And this was just something that from a risk perspective, we wanted to avoid. So instead, what we did is within the same cloud infrastructure, we set up a second container right alongside next to them, and we retained full authority over that cloud container, and they controlled their entire cloud container. Now, to move traffic between them, if you're in the same cloud, the same environment, you could just let local cloud routing take care of it. You could do something like a VNet pairing. You could do something like a VPN tunnel. That's up to your architectural decisions and your requirements. So let's talk about policy. Within a single web environment, do we want to have one policy to rule them all? The same policy on test, on stage, on prod? And initially I thought yes, but this is where we ran into issues that in a couple of our environments, they were functionality different. And so that caused us to pull out of some environments, especially if they weren't feature for feature. And that really took me back a little bit. Additionally, we need to pay attention to cryptography. So I went through and I found in a couple environments that we were using generic vendor supplied wildcards, especially in the cloud. And so we had to switch them over to our corporate CA. And of course, we need to go through and we need to evaluate things like crypto strength and ciphers that we are allowing. Now, granted, I had a very naive view of production coming into this environment. I used to think of production as the now state of production, where stage was the near future state of production and test was the future stage. After sitting in of years of change control, where I saw our dev apps promote bug fixes from test to stage to dev to prod, I figured that we were going to go through and have a very similar rollout of our actual bugs that we find, of the policy configuration tweaks that we need to make on the WAFs. This was not so. In fact, we found very quickly that a block could be thrown at any level. And as I dug into it with the developers, it became fairly obvious that the reason that we were having this was because we didn't have equal testing at all levels in the environment. In fact, everything below our stage really didn't have as rich and as polished testing as we really needed. And so this is why I constantly harp that you need to have a mix of human and automated testing at all levels. And what we found was that we needed a process in order to do a policy push, whether it was the expected bottom up, top down, or middle out. So on policy pushes, once again, volume and diversity of traffic is key in lower environments. You need to know, you need to think about what is going to trigger a policy push. Is it time? Is it event? Is it criticality? And chances are it's going to be all of them, all of those. When do you promote a learning suggestion based on deployments? Do you tie into the normal deployment schedule as part of their deployments? Or do you go through and do you deploy your learning suggestions a week early? That way you can reduce some confusion during the actual deployments. When demoting a policy from a higher environment to a lower environment, how do you ensure that that policy that you're going to go through and you're going to push is going to be customized for that environment? Can you promote, demote a single learning suggestion? Or do you go through and promote, demote the entire policy? Do you have a mono policy that covers the entire web application? I used to be in favor of that. However, we went through and we quickly found out that there were certain parts of our web application that acted really unique to just that part. And we felt comfortable unblocking certain functionality to just that part, but not the entire website. That would just be a little too much risk. So we went through and we created a microservice, or it might be called a parent/child policy relationship, but that really went through and fixed up a lot of things. And finally, how do we track moves, adds, changes, not only to help us in case we need to troubleshoot, but for the sake that internal audit comes to us? So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but what I'd like to challenge you that you should do within the next week is take an inventory of your web applications and identify those web applications that you feel could benefit from the enhanced security controls a WAF can provide. I challenge you to map out a project team to establish both scope and justification for a WAF investment. In the first 3 months after this presentation, I challenge you, identify a diverse team to review WAF solutions and to deploy at least one web application firewall into a non-production environment. Within 6 months, you should complete tuning of at least one WAF and place it into blocking mode. And of course, we need to create, train, and empower our support team so that we can provide support. I'd love to continue this conversation here, there, or anywhere. You can follow me on Twitter at Micah K. Brown. You can take a look at my GitHub, github.com/Micah K. Brown, where I publish all of my talks. I'd like to thank everyone that is responsible for going through and putting this conference together. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you and have a great day.